One.
Hi everyone. Here's a little post-standard video just to give you some information and some details that I don't think some students covered depending on what option they chose for standards, but it's really important information, so I want to make sure we go over it somehow. And that is some humanist writing from the Renaissance. You may have heard of Thomas More's Utopia as a good example, but it's really understand, a little bit about Machiavelli, and specifically about his book, The Prince. So Machiavelli was born in Florence, Italy in May of 1469. He was a political philosopher and a diplomat during the Renaissance. He wrote The Prince. He wrote many things, but his Prince is essential reading for modern political theory. And I think I told many of the classes that if you're ever in any sort of political science class, you'll definitely need to read The Prince. And also, you hear the term Machiavellian a lot if you watch the news or something relating to history or politics. So it's important that you understand what that means. Let's lower this back here. So The Prince was all about how a ruler should keep their power, more specifically a monarch. He recommended policies that would discourage mass political activism, yet channel his subjects' energies into private pursuits. Think of individualism in the Renaissance, right? He wanted to persuade a monarch, the prince or whoever, that they could best keep their power by a very careful use of violence, right? Also by promoting the material prosperity of their people. He thought that political life couldn't be governed by a set of moral or certain religious values, and that the monarch has to sometimes be excused from them and actually must perform acts of violence and deceit um, in order to keep their power. So, because of things like that, this book was condemned by Pope Clement, and it did provoke a lot of controversy. Now, you see on the right here an image of Cesar Borgia. He was a Spanish aristocrat who became really notorious and a hated tyrant um, of a region of northern Italy. And while Machiavelli was a diplomat, he was in contact with him, and he witnessed the way Borgia ruled firsthand. So some believe that Machiavelli was sort of modeling this idea of a perfect prince after him. Others saw it as a satire on rulers such as him. Actually, but a letter was found in 1810 by Machiavelli, and it discovered that he wrote the prince basically to put him in good favors with the Medici family of Florence. So when he writes The Prince, this is political philosophy, remember. So he opens up saying that there's two basic type of governments. You have monarchies and republics. And here he focuses on a monarchy. And in his later chapters of the book, he gets into some ideas as to why, and those ideas are why the book did become so controversial. So here's some examples. He concludes that some virtues, which most of society esteems, could lead to a prince's destruction, whereas some vices, which society might generally oppose, may actually allow the prince to survive. He also writes about generosity and mentions that if generosity or doing good deeds or charitable deeds are done in secret, no one will know about that. And then they'll think the prince is greedy. But if you do it openly, then you risk basically going broke to maintain uh, that reputation of being helpful and generous. So it's actually best, in Machiavelli's opinion, for the monarch to be basically a little stingy. So that wasn't well received by some either. He also argues later in chapter 17 that it's better for a prince to be severe when punishing his subjects rather than being merciful. Yeah, you know what? It hurts a few people if you're going to commit the death penalty, but it's going to maybe deter crime which will affect many people. One of his more famous lines is the idea that it's better to be feared than loved. Keep in mind, he does say, if you can't be both, right? Be feared and loved. The prince should avoid being hated completely, um, but this is to basically make sure you get things done. Later, by chapter 18, he argues that a prince should know how to be deceitful when it suits his purpose. But when he is being deceitful, you must not appear that way. So it's all about appearances. And he actually said that there are five virtues that they should still try to perceive to have. That's mercy, honesty, humaneness, uprightness, and religiousness. So you might not really have them, but you need to sort of appear that you have them. And that alone is deceitful. So, why would he write about all this? Remember that Italy was not one nation at the time. It was a lot of different city states, and they were in conflict with each other. But as they were in conflict, they were open to invasion by Spain and France. And he said, so this isn't good. And he actually called for Italian unity to end all that foreign intervention. So writing this is important for many reasons. It's the first major political philosophy, and he's the first major political philosopher of the Renaissance. Now political science is a thing. It's something you can major in and get a PhD in. And he was sort of the one that led that during the Renaissance. And also because this focuses on practical problems, not just ideals or fancy things that would be nice, but actual practical how to solve certain issues in this time. Also remember, the Medici family are tied into this. They ruled Florence for a long time, except for a little period in between. During that in-between period is when Machiavelli was a diplomat. He sort of left politics when the Medici came back, and he tried to win their good graces, and he actually did for the last 2 years of his life. Now, the Prince was written in 1513. It was not published until after he died in 1532. That's published in today's meaning. Back then, published just meant you shared with others. I mentioned in some classes the Rosselli Gardens, for example. So he did share the ideas, but it was not put into printing until later. Was part of it because he feared the reaction? Some believe that that's possibly why. Here's just a little quick overview so you see. There's so much more of his life I could include about his missions to France. When was his first one? 1500, I think. Or no, 1499. He goes again in 1504, then again in 1510. That's the role of a diplomat. So he spent time out of Italy and Florence. I read a book in the summer of 2016, That Hill High, and it was a really interesting biography of Machiavelli. So it was more than just the prince. It was about, his personal life with his wife and others, and his different writings and things. And it was called Machiavelli: A Portrait by Christopher S. Salenza. So if you're curious, I have that if you want to read more about him. I have pages of notes that I took, but here's just a couple of random facts. He was known as a literatus. So think of what it means today to be literate. But at that time, looks like I'm missing a quotation mark there, it meant someone who had fluency in Latin. So think of that as a Renaissance characteristic because they looked back to the classics, right? So you see how he is a Renaissance man in many ways here. That's one. So continuing the idea of going back to the ancients in the Renaissance, he thought that studying it was pure and was natural. He described it as the food for which I was born. He actually would go home every evening and put on his formal clothes and then read the ancients' work because he thought they deserved that respect, that he couldn't just read them and what would be today our sweats when we go home at night, Here's something interesting as well. When your teachers tell you not to use you and I in your essays, well, he thought, no, his writings were meant to be a conversation, and he did that. Concerning history, In political science, he also thought that conflict was unavoidable and cities